المشتاق لا تنمي هذه أنوار ذي سلمي عن قليل أنت في الحرم عند خير العرب والعجم
قف أمام القابر بالأدب.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله الرحمن الرحيم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الفاتحة. من يتعلم التعليم والتذكر والتذكير والنفع والانتفاع والإفادة والاستفادة والحث على تمسك بكتاب الله وسنة رسوله والدعاء على الهدى والدلال على الخير ابتغاء وجه الله ومرضاته وقربه وثوابه سبحانه وتعالى. وعلى ما نوى نبينا سيدنا محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وعلى ما سلم سلفا على ما نوى المؤلف الحبيب أحمد بن زين الحبشي وعلى شيخ الحبيب أحمد إسماعيل وإن الله الحبشي بين الله لخير نياتنا في نياتهم وأعمالنا في أعمالهم وأخلاقنا في أخلاقهم وطريقتنا في طريقتهم المقبول. وعلى حضرة النبي سيدنا محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم. الفاتحة. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. So alhamdulillah, we return towards the concluding chapter of Risalah al-Jami'ah after a long break from the second week of Sha'ban. Okay, so we carry on to Habib Ahmad bin Zain's discussion on having a bad opinion of Allah and of His servants, right, and on trivializing that which Allah magnified. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وآله وصحبه وسلم. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. اللهم انفعنا بما علمتنا وعلمنا ما ينفعنا وزدنا علما. اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. وإلى أن قال رضي الله عنه ونفعنا به وبعلومه وبعلوم شيخنا في الدارين آمين. رضي الله عنه. وسوء الظن بالله وبخلق الله. Yeah, so we continue with the vices, right, the mortal vices of the heart. And from amongst these vices is to hold a poor opinion of Allah or of Allah's slaves. Right? To have a poor opinion about Allah and His slaves. Okay, with regards to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there's a hadith Qudsi. He says, I am as my servant thinks I am. I.e., as he expects me to be. I am with him when he makes mention of me. If he makes mention of me to himself, I make mention of him to myself. And if he mentions me in an assembly, I mention him in an assembly better than it. And if he draws near to me an arm's length, I draw near to him a fathom's length. And if he comes to me walking, I go to him running. Right? Or I go to him at speed. Okay, so this shows, highlights for us very clearly Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's mercy and forgiveness, right, and generosity, and all that is expected of us is to, when we're seeking this forgiveness and mercy, is that we truly believe in His forgiveness, in His quality of being all forgiving and all merciful, right, but also dependent on, and the condition is that we perform good deeds and avoid His prohibitions, right? So it has to be accompanied by right action. Right? Otherwise, that's disrespecting. That's poor. It's poor adab, poor manners, observing poor courtesy with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay, but this is what He says. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Hadith Qudsi, right? Related by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, I am as my servant thinks I am. So as we expect Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be, if we have a good opinion of Allah, right, we will never be disappointed, inshallah. Okay, however, this good opinion, right, does not entail that the legally responsible or the mukallaf slave, servant, should simply have more hope than fear in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Yeah, but this having a good opinion should be understood properly. Right, in the matter of fear and hope, Habib Abdullah al-Haddad rahimahullah elaborated as follows. Okay, there are three kinds. He divided the servants into three kinds, right? Each of whom have a specific, should adopt a specific attitude, right, with regards in terms of the balance between their fear and hope. So first we have the steadfast believer, right? So the best for the believer who is steadfast upon obedience to Allah, who obeys Allah generally most of the time, right, all the time, right, is to be in between fear and hope, right, such that they become like the wings of a bird. Fear and hope become like the wings of a bird, or the scales of the balance. Okay, that is the believer, this steadfast believer, who has achieved istiqamah, right? He alternately uses fear and hope to perform obedience and to avoid disobedience. And so when he is feeling a bit lax to perform an obedience, to perform some worship, right, then he uses the fear of being distanced from Allah, right, to whip him as a whip, to push his nafs to maintain and sustain his worship, his practice. On the other hand, or he uses it to avoid falling into either to make sure that he does not give up on a worship, on a form of worship that he's already been consistent in, right, to maintain consistency, or to avoid falling into sin. Okay, falling into sin, or falling into laxness, falling into giving into laziness, right? And then hope also that, through this, that he will entice his nafs, right, to perform the obedience in the hope of Allah's good pleasure, okay, or the hope of his reward. Okay, so for the one who is steadfast, for the steadfast believer, he should be in between fear and hope all the time, right? Sometimes using fear, sometimes using hope, right, to help guide his nafs, to bring his nafs, his soul itself, to be consistent upon good works. And then there is the other kind of believer, the wavering believer, or the sinning believer, who mixes, right? This believer is the kind who mixes good and evil. So he does good works, right, but sometimes he falls into sin as well. Yeah? And so this person is the one who fears that he might fall into neglecting obedience, right, or going against Allah's prohibitions. So for this person, it is better, for this type of person, it is better and more fitting for him to have a preponderance of fear. For fear, his fear to overcome his hope. Okay? Generally, his fear should be more than his hope for this person. And this is the safer option, the safer configuration for this person, that his fear should outweigh his hope. Yeah. Of course, his hope must always be there, it remains, but his fear should count heavier in the balance. Okay, thirdly, Abdullah Haddad specifies the believer who is on the verge of death. Now, for this person, he should have a preponderance of hope and good opinion of Allah over fear. So he should think well. He should force himself to think well of Allah. He should remind himself to think well of Allah. Right, since the Prophet ﷺ said that none of you, in a hadith he said ﷺ, that none of you should die except in a state of having a good opinion of Allah. Okay. So this is the elaboration given by Habib Abdullah bin Ali al-Haddad, the teacher of Habib Ahmad Mirza al-Habshi, right, with regards having a good opinion of Allah, right, and the types of people in relation to this virtue of having a good opinion. Okay, so that's with regards to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And with regards to his servants, his slaves, in the Quran, Allah has already mentioned, Allah has stated in the Quran, "O you who have believed, avoid much negative assumption." Right? Some assumption is sin. So the word used in the Quran here is dhan, right? Su'ul dhan. Ya ayyuhallazina amanu ijtanibu kathiran min al-dhan. Right? So in this verse, right? Su'ul dhan is when we're talking is poor opinion, having a poor opinion or bad or ill opinion of another. Okay, so negative assumption here is we're talking about poor opinion. Alright, so Allah commands, Allah warns against it, right? Because some of it is sin. So it's better, Allah tells us to stay away, right, from making this a habit, right? Also, the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam said there are two traits above which there is nothing greater in goodness. First is having a good opinion of Allah. Second is having a good opinion of his slaves. And there are two traits above which there is nothing greater in evil. There's nothing worse than them, which is having a poor opinion of Allah and having a poor opinion of his slaves, assuming the worst of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or of his slaves. And the Prophet also warns of suspicion, right? He calls suspicion is the worst of false tales. And the meaning of having a poor opinion of the Muslims is that one holds a poor opinion of their speech or actions when the outward appearance of this speech or actions is good, right? But this person who is insists on holding to a poor opinion, he assumes the opposite of the good that is apparent from the speech or actions. So from the speech or the actions, it seems good, for this guy, maybe somebody is dressed up in religious scholarly clothes, right? Or the clothes that a worshipper would put on, right, with a kufiya, but this maybe is an example of someone who thinks ill, right? It's maybe somebody assumes, right, the person who assumes that this person is doing it to gain standing, right, with people, or to gain the respect of people, or to gain some sort of status in their eyes. Okay, if that was the case, of course that is blameworthy, right? But to assume it, right, without clear evidence, without manifest evidence, right, is not permissible. Okay, so either one holds a poor opinion of their speech or actions whose outward appearance is good, or that one assumes the worst, right, when it is equally possible to interpret these actions or speech as good. So there's a 50-50 possibility. It might be this thing that is in contention, this action or speech, right? There's a possibility that it comes from a good place, right? That the reality of it is a good or is a sincere reality, but one insists on. This is equally likely, right, as it being an evil or an act of showing off, for example. But instead of choosing the option of choosing to believe that it's a good, that there's a good, the reality of it is good, he chooses to believe that the reality of it is evil. Okay, basically it's not a charitable interpretation. Okay, insisting on being miserly in interpreting others' actions or speech. So Imam Ghazali warns in the Ihya, when one comes to an evil conclusion about another based on conjecture, based on assumption, or based on a poor opinion, then the devil incites him to speak ill of that person, right? I.e. is to act based on that poor opinion of the person, right? To speak ill of him, to slander him. Okay, so the believer, Imam Ghazali says, the believer seeks excuses, right, while the hypocrite seeks out flaws, right, of others. Okay, so to hold a poor opinion, to hold a bad opinion of others is as haram, is as much forbidden as speaking ill of them. So one should not even think such thoughts to oneself. Don't even think such thoughts to ourselves. What is meant right? What is meant, what these thoughts that he means, right, is that inner speech, right, in our heart when we talk to ourselves with conviction. So that is haram. When it has conviction, that is haram. As for passing thoughts, these are excusable. Right? Sometimes these thoughts strike you and then we ignore them and they move along. Right? And doubt also is excusable. Right? 50-50 type thoughts. It could be, it could not. Right? But when the suspicion is preponderant, right, when maybe 70% probability or acceptance, right, and this is haram. Right? So this suspicion is understood as that which the nafs or the self accepts and the heart inclines towards. Okay, so it might or might not be true, right? But the suspicion that is haram, when it is the suspicion that is haram when it's not based in fact, right, and it's still based in conjecture, is that which is preponderant, which is maybe 70% acceptance by the self. Okay, what is 50% or less is excusable, according to Imam Ghazali. So this is what it is a form of backbiting with the heart, not with the tongue. So having a poor opinion, that kind of suspicion that he talks about earlier, is backbiting with the heart, right, as opposed to backbiting with the tongue. So he mentions, Imam Ghazali goes on, he continues to explain that the wisdom behind prohibition, why it's haram, right, is that none but the all-knower of the unseen, Allam al-Ghuyub, right, the Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, none but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows the secrets of the hearts. And so it is not our place, right, to judge another with evil, except when the matter is revealed to us with a clarity that gives no room for a saving interpretation. So it's very obvious in front, someone does a haram, right, and the malice and the evil of the act is revealed to you and you see it with your own eyes, right, in your own ears, and you hear it with your own ears, then there is no room for a saving interpretation. It's not possible. So at that point, we're not allowed any position other than what is manifest to us, right, what has been made clear to us. But when one has not arrived at that certainty, right, through the evidence of one's own senses, it is only the devil that suggests such ill judgments to our hearts, and we are expected to, it is obligatory for us to reject his claims, since the devil is the most corrupt of corruptors. Okay, so that's a section from the Ihya explaining this su'adhan, yeah, having a poor opinion, right, about Allah's slaves. Yeah, in the final part of this section, right, Habib Abdullah al-Haddad goes on, وَتَصْغِيرُ لِمَا عَظَّمَ اللَّهُ مِنْ طَاعَةٍ أَوْ مَعْصِيَةٍ أَوْ قُرْآنٍ أَوْ عِلْمٍ أَوْ جَنَّةٍ أَوْ نَارٍ وكل ذلك من المعاصي والخبائث المهلكات بل بعد ذلك مما يدخل في الكفر والعياذ بالله تعالى من ذلك. Okay, and carry on. The next final mortal vice that he's talking about in this section is that we trivialize what Allah has magnified. We belittle or make small what Allah has made great or grand. Okay, whether this is of obedience or disobedience, or whether it's the Quran or knowledge or the garden, right, paradise, or the fire, hell, and all of these, including the earlier acts, the vices that were mentioned earlier. So all of these are acts of disobedience and will lead to one's destruction. And the translation, mortal vices. Okay, in fact, some of them cause them to enter into a state of disbelief, right? And God's refuge is sought from that. Okay, so some of these sins are so great as to put the one who commits these actions outside of Islam. Okay, so examples he gives that belittling an act of obedience, even if it's small or little, because there's a possibility that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's pleasure is attached to that little action, right? Or if someone belittles an act of disobedience, even if it's small, right, because therein, in that disobedience, could be Allah's anger, right? Or belittling the Quran, right? Or anything of its commands or prohibitions or threats or promises, or belittling any signs of the secret law, hadith, tafsir, figure, and so on, or even the ancillary, the supporting sciences, the tools, the instruments of knowledge, right? Like nahu, grammar, or morphology, and so on. Or belittling anything of paradise or hell, or the resurrection, right? Or accounting, qiyamah or hisab. Okay, so basically belittling or joking about, in a sense, in a malicious sense, or mocking any of the emblems or symbols of Islam, okay, in a malicious way, right, results in kufur, right, puts the person who is joking or mocking these things outside of Islam. Okay, so that's it for this week, inshallah. Sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Muhammad wa ala alihi wasallam.
يا ربنا اعترفنا بأننا اقترفنا وأننا أسرفنا على لظى أشرفنا فضلا وجودا منا لا باكتساب منا بالمصطفى الرسول نحظى بكل سول بالمصطفى الرسول نحظى بكل سول بالمصطفى الرسول نحظى بكل